Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. Beneath the unrelenting skies of a frozen wasteland, a lone soldier fought against the elements, his body battered, his spirit fraying with each step. Marcus, a man once hardened by the fires of war, was now little more than a shadow of his former self. The icy wind howled like a predator, clawing at his exposed skin, slicing through the tatters of his thermal gear. Every breath he took was a sharp, painful reminder of how close he was to the edge. His mission had failed, a covert operation that turned to ashes in the chaos of betrayal. His unit was gone, his comms silent, and the ship that was meant to extract him was likely a smoldering wreck somewhere far beyond the horizon. The world around him was devoid of mercy, painted in shades of white and gray, a frozen void that seemed eager to claim him as its own. Snow clung to his boots, heavy and relentless, pulling him down as if the planet itself wanted to swallow him whole. Through the blinding storm, his vision blurred by exhaustion and frostbite, Marcus caught a flicker of light. He stopped, swaying on unsteady legs, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him. It had been hours, no days, since he'd seen anything but the lifeless expanse. Yet there it was, shimmering faintly in the distance. A beacon, hope, or a cruel hallucination. He stumbled forward, every step a battle against the elements and his failing body. As the light grew brighter, the outline of a structure came into view, unlike anything he'd seen before. Towering and crystalline, it shimmered like a dream against the unforgiving backdrop of the storm. The structure pulsed faintly, as if alive, radiating warmth that beckoned him closer. Marcus's instincts screamed at him to remain cautious, but desperation silenced them. Death was at his heels, and whatever lay ahead could be no worse than the fate the cold had planned for him. As he approached, the wind seemed to ease, the storm retreating as if unwilling to trespass near the glowing palace. The structure loomed above him, impossibly intricate, its spires reaching toward the heavens like frozen fire. The surface was smooth and unblemished, reflecting the dim light of the twin moons above. His breath caught, not from the cold, but from the sheer beauty of it, a sight that felt both alien and sacred. Then a voice. Soft, melodic, and otherworldly. It drifted toward him like the gentlest caress, cutting through the remnants of the storm. "Come inside," it whispered, barely louder than the wind, yet unmistakable in its clarity. Marcus froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm holstered at his hip. The voice carried no malice, only warmth, but his soldier's instincts were not so easily quieted. His eyes scanned the palace's entrance, searching for movement, for threats, for anything that might explain the strange invitation. Instead, a figure emerged. She stepped into the light like a goddess descending from the heavens. Her form was slender, her movements fluid and graceful, as though she were untouched by the harsh reality around her. Her skin shimmered like polished opal, shifting faintly with every motion, and her eyes glowed with a light that seemed to pierce straight into his soul. Iridescent and endless, they held a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, something he couldn't name. "Come," she said again, her voice wrapping around him like a warm embrace. "You will die out here if you stay." Marcus tightened his grip on his weapon, though his fingers were trembling now, not from fear but from the overwhelming exhaustion weighing down his body. Who are you?" he managed, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the distance between them. "I am Celeria," she replied, taking another step forward. The snow beneath her feet didn't crunch, it seemed to melt away with her touch. "This is my home. You need shelter. Let me help you." Her words were simple, and yet there was something in her tone, something disarming. Marcus's instincts screamed at him to keep his guard up, but his body betrayed him. The warmth radiating from her was intoxicating after hours, perhaps days, of relentless cold. His knees buckled, and he dropped to the snow, panting, his strength nearly gone. Celeria moved swiftly, reaching him before he could collapse entirely. Her touch was light, her hands impossibly soft as they steadied him. Up close, her beauty was even more striking. The delicate iridescence of her skin seemed to shift with the faintest light, creating an effect that was both mesmerizing and surreal. Her presence was overwhelming, like standing too close to a flame after being in the dark for too long. "You're human," she said softly, almost to herself, as though she were savoring the word. There was no fear or disdain in her voice, only curiosity, as if he were a rare artifact she had discovered. "Come," she urged again, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "You need warmth." Marcus hesitated, his mind a swirl of uncertainty, but the last remnants of his strength were fading fast. He had no choice. With a final glance at the endless, unforgiving expanse behind him, he allowed her to guide him toward the glowing entrance of the crystalline palace. Her touch, her warmth, it was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, and for the first time since the mission went south, Marcus felt the faintest flicker of hope. Still, as he crossed the threshold, his mind remained alert. Her beauty, her grace, they were undeniable. But nothing about this place felt ordinary, and nothing about her felt entirely innocent. As Marcus crossed the threshold into Celeria's sanctuary, the air around him transformed almost instantly. The biting cold that had threatened to devour him vanished, replaced by an inviting warmth that seemed to seep into his very bones. The chamber she led him into was unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls shimmered, not with static light, but with a gentle, rhythmic glow, as though the entire structure were alive and breathing. Colors danced across the surface, soft blues, silvers, and faint pinks, illuminating the space with a surreal, almost dreamlike quality. The scent of the air was equally mesmerizing, rich and sweet, with undertones of something exotic and unfamiliar. It was intoxicating, filling his lungs with every breath and dulling the edge of his exhaustion. Marcus's eyes darted around, trying to take in the intricacy of the space. The furnishings, if they could even be called that, seemed to grow organically from the floor, smooth and elegant with no harsh edges. Everything about the room exuded a sense of beauty and tranquility, but there was an underlying strangeness that he couldn't shake. Celeria moved ahead of him, her steps silent and fluid, her form glowing faintly in the ambient light. Marcus's instincts, honed by years of combat, whispered warnings, but he pushed them aside. Survival was all that mattered now, and whatever she was offering, shelter, warmth, aid, was far better than the certain death waiting outside. Still, his hand hovered near the holster at his side, fingers brushing against the cold steel of his weapon. He wasn't foolish enough to let his guard down completely. "Sit," Celeria said softly, her voice pulling his attention back to her. She gestured toward a low, curved surface that looked like a cross between a bed and a reclining chair. It was faintly illuminated, the light within pulsing gently, as though in rhythm with her own movements. Marcus hesitated, his eyes meeting hers. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and amusement. "You're safe here," she added, her tone warm but firm. "The storm cannot touch you. Neither can the pain." Reluctantly, he lowered himself onto the surface, the material conforming to his body in an oddly comforting way. He hadn't realized how much his body ached until the weight lifted from his feet. Celeria knelt beside him, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Up close, her features were even more striking, her skin shimmering faintly, her eyes like pools of liquid light. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. "You're hurt," she said, her voice soft and almost reverent. "Let me help you." Before Marcus could respond, Celeria waved a hand, and a small device emerged from the wall, floating gracefully toward her. The device emitted a faint hum, its surface smooth and glowing with faint lines of alien script. She held it delicately, her fingers tracing its contours as though it were an extension of herself. The hum grew slightly louder as she passed it over his body, and Marcus felt a tingling warmth spread through his limbs. "What is that?" he asked, his voice rough with suspicion. "A tool of healing," she replied, not looking up. It will repair what the cold and the battle have taken from you. The warmth intensified as she moved the device over his injured leg, the torn fabric of his uniform parting seamlessly under its touch. Marcus watched, equal parts fascinated and uneasy, as the deep gash in his flesh began to close, the pain receding as though it had never been there. Her hands were steady, her touch gentle but deliberate, lingering just long enough to send a faint shiver up his spine. "You've seen much violence," she said after a moment, her tone quieter now. "Your body bears the marks of it." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Her words weren't accusatory, but they struck a chord he wasn't ready to face. He shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. There was something in the way she spoke, something probing, as if she were peeling back layers he wasn't prepared to reveal. "And what do you know about violence?" he asked, his voice edged with weariness. Celeria smiled faintly, her gaze meeting his. "More than you might think," she said simply, but there was no elaboration. Instead, she focused on his arm, her fingers brushing against his skin as she worked. The warmth of her touch lingered long after the device had passed. As the moments stretched on, the tension between them began to shift. Marcus found himself watching her movements, the way her hands moved with precision and grace, the way her expression softened as she worked. There was an elegance to her, a quiet strength that felt at odds with her delicate appearance. Her presence was disarming, and despite himself, Marcus felt the faintest flicker of trust beginning to take root. "Your people," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "They are fascinating." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Fascinating?" he repeated, the skepticism clear in his tone. Celeria tilted her head, studying him with that same curious expression. "You are unlike any species I have encountered," she said. "So resilient. So determined." He snorted softly, leaning back against the surface beneath him. "You don't know humanity very well, do you?" Her lips curved into a small smile. "I know enough," she said, her tone teasing now. "I've read stories of your warriors. Fierce, unyielding, untrusting. You, Marcus, fit those stories perfectly." "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" he asked, his voice dry but not without humor. "Perhaps," she replied, her smile widening. "Though I think there is more to you than the stories suggest." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Marcus shifted, his gaze dropping to his hands as the weight of her words settled over him. The cracks in his stoic facade were beginning to show, and he hated how easily she seemed to see through him. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter now. "I lost my team," he said, the words heavy with regret. "We were supposed to be in and out, but someone sold us out. They're all gone now. And I'm here. Running." Celeria's expression softened, her gaze unwavering as she listened. There was no judgment in her eyes, only empathy, a depth of understanding that made his chest tighten. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand in a gesture that was both comforting and intimate. "You carry their memory with you," she said softly. "That is not weakness, Marcus. That is strength." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Marcus allowed himself to breathe. Celeria's presence was unlike anything he had ever known, warm, disarming, and impossibly magnetic. And as the light around them continued to pulse in a gentle, soothing rhythm, Marcus felt the walls he had built around himself beginning to falter. Over the following days, Marcus found himself reluctantly surrendering to the strange rhythm of life within the crystalline palace. His injuries, once a constant reminder of his fragility, had healed with remarkable speed, thanks to the advanced technology Celeria wielded so effortlessly. The warmth of the palace, both literal and figurative, began to strip away the icy layers of his guarded demeanor. Each day brought new wonders, and Celeria, his enigmatic host, was there to guide him through them. The palace was vast, far larger than it had seemed from the outside. Celeria took him through its halls, their walls shimmering with the same living light that seemed to pulse in time with his steps. She explained little at first, allowing him to experience the marvels for himself. They came to a garden unlike anything Marcus had ever imagined. It stretched endlessly, filled with plants that defied every natural law he knew. Leaves shimmered in iridescent hues, shifting colors with every change in his mood. Flowers bloomed and folded as he moved, responding to the smallest gestures of his hand or the softest breath he exhaled. "Your emotions guide them," Celeria said, her voice soft as she watched him with quiet fascination. "They feel your presence, your thoughts. They reflect you." Marcus hesitated, his hand hovering over a glowing vine that seemed to reach toward him. "It's alive," he murmured, unsure whether to be awed or unnerved. "Alive, yes," she replied, stepping closer. "But not in the way you know life. They are an extension of this place. Of me." Her words lingered, raising questions he didn't know how to ask. Instead, he focused on the beauty before him, allowing himself, for the first time in years, to marvel at something that wasn't forged for destruction. Later, she took him to an observatory that made even the garden pale in comparison. The room was vast and open, its walls and ceiling a transparent, crystalline material that offered an uninterrupted view of the cosmos. Galaxies sprawled out in every direction, their light so close it felt as though he could reach out and touch the stars themselves. Celeria stood beside him, her expression serene, but there was a glimmer of something deeper in her eyes, something wistful. "This was where I used to dream," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Before the wars, before the cold." Marcus turned to her, his gaze narrowing slightly. "The wars?" She nodded slowly, her luminous eyes fixed on the stars. "My people were not unlike yours," she said. "Proud, ambitious, and flawed." She paused, her voice thickening with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "We created wonders, built empires, reached beyond our world. But we also destroyed each other. Greed, mistrust, power, it tore us apart." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. Marcus remained silent, giving her the space to continue. "The cold came after," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "It crept in slowly at first, a consequence of our own making. And then it consumed everything. Those who didn't die in the wars fell to the ice. Those who survived the ice succumbed to the loneliness." Marcus felt a pang in his chest, a sympathy he didn't expect. "And you?" he asked, his voice softer now. "How did you survive?" Celeria's gaze shifted to him, her eyes filled with a vulnerability that caught him off guard. "I was spared," she said simply. "Why, I don't know. Perhaps as punishment. Perhaps as a cruel mercy." She looked away again, her voice trembling. "I have been alone ever since." Her confession struck a chord deep within Marcus. He recognized the weight of isolation, the ache of carrying memories no one else could share. For all her grace, for all her beauty, Celeria was no goddess. She was broken, just as he was. As the silence stretched between them, Marcus found himself speaking, his voice quieter now. "I know what it's like," he said. "To lose everything. To be surrounded by death and wonder if you'll be next. To keep going because you don't know what else to do." Celeria turned to him, her expression softening. "Then perhaps," she said gently, "we are not so different, you and I." The words stirred something in him, a warmth that pushed back the cold that had gripped him for so long. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the alien princess who had saved his life, but a kindred soul. A spark ignited between them, unspoken but undeniable. As the moment stretched, Celeria took a step closer, her luminous eyes searching his. "Marcus," she said, his name a soft melody on her lip. "For so long I have longed to feel something, anything. And now—" She didn't finish her sentence, but she didn't need to. The distance between them closed, her face so close to his that he could feel the faint warmth of her breath. The tension between them crackled, charged with emotions neither of them had dared to express. And then she leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was both tentative and searing. Marcus hesitated for only a moment before surrendering, his hands finding her waist as the intensity of the moment deepened. The kiss was unlike anything he had ever experienced, fierce yet tender, alien yet achingly familiar. It was a connection, raw and unfiltered, that spoke of their shared loneliness, their shared need. The world seemed to still around them, the stars above burning brighter as if in recognition of their union. But just as the moment threatened to consume them, a low, deep vibration reverberated through the palace. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily, a sound that seemed to resonate from the very core of the crystalline walls. Celeria pulled back abruptly, her glowing eyes wide with something Marcus couldn't name. She glanced around, her expression tense, and for the first time since he had met her, she seemed genuinely unsettled. Marcus straightened, his instincts snapping to attention. "What was that?" he asked, his voice sharp. Celeria didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the walls as though she could see beyond them. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter now, tinged with something he couldn't place. "Something I did not expect." The warmth they had shared just moments before lingered in the air between them, but the sound had changed something. Marcus felt it too, a shift, subtle but undeniable. And though he didn't know what lay ahead, he knew this much. Whatever had just been set in motion, it would challenge everything they thought they knew. As the days stretched into nights within the crystalline palace, Marcus found himself increasingly attuned to its peculiarities. At first, they were subtle, mere whispers of unease that he brushed aside in favor of recovery and the strange comfort Celeria provided. But the longer he stayed, the more he began to notice the details that didn't quite align with the stories Celeria had shared. The palace, for all its beauty and warmth, seemed to possess an energy of its own. It wasn't just the pulsing light on the walls or the organic way the furniture shifted to accommodate him. It was the feeling that the structure itself was observing him, reacting to his presence in ways he couldn't fully understand. When he ran his fingers along the smooth, glowing walls, he felt faint ridges beneath the surface, patterns that, upon closer inspection, resembled scars. Long, jagged lines marred the perfection of the crystalline surfaces, as though the palace had once endured something violent. He didn't ask Celeria about them immediately, unsure of how to frame his suspicions without sounding accusatory. But the marks lingered in his mind, a silent reminder that her sanctuary might not be as peaceful as she had claimed. Celeria, meanwhile, seemed to grow bolder in her interactions with him. Her touches, once fleeting and careful, now lingered longer than necessary. A brush of her hand against his arm, a light touch on his shoulder, they were small gestures, but they carried an unmistakable weight. Her gaze, too, had changed. There was an intensity in the way she looked at him, her luminous eyes holding his with a focus that felt almost consuming. Marcus tried to shake off his discomfort, but it only grew when he stumbled upon something he couldn't ignore. It was late, and the palace was silent save for its faint, rhythmic hum. He had ventured into a section of the palace he hadn't explored before, drawn by a nagging curiosity. There, in a room that seemed untouched by time, he found them, human artifacts. A rusted knife with a worn grip, a tattered jacket bearing an insignia he didn't recognize, a faded photograph of a man and a woman, their faces smiling back at him through the thin veil of dust that covered the image. His chest tightened as he stared at the objects. They were unmistakably human, and they carried a history he couldn't begin to piece together. The question burned in his mind: who had these belonged to, and why were they here? When he returned to the main chamber, Celeria was waiting for him. She stood near the central light source of the palace, its glow casting an almost ethereal halo around her. Her expression softened as she saw him, but Marcus was no longer in the mood for her enigmatic charm. "Celeria," he said, his voice firm, though not yet harsh. "We need to talk." She tilted her head slightly, her expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Of course," she replied, her voice as gentle as ever. "What troubles you?" Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph, holding it up for her to see. "This," he said, his tone sharper now. "I found this in one of the rooms. Along with a jacket. And a knife. Human artifacts, Celeria. Things that shouldn't be here." Her gaze flickered to the photograph, and for the first time since he'd met her, she hesitated. It was brief, but it was enough for Marcus to press on. "You told me I was the first human you'd seen," he continued, stepping closer. "But this says otherwise. So tell me the truth. What's really going on here?" Celeria's serene demeanor cracked, her eyes lowering as she seemed to weigh her response. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, almost regretful. "You weren't the first," she admitted, the words falling heavily between them. "There were others." Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What happened to them?" Her luminous eyes met his, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, or sorrow. But when she spoke again, her tone had shifted. It was no longer soft or hesitant. It was deliberate. "They're gone," she said simply. "And they left this behind." Marcus narrowed his eyes, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's not good enough," he snapped. "Gone how? What happened to them, Celeria?" She took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Do you really want to know, Marcus?" she asked, her voice low. "Do you truly want to understand what I am?" The air between them seemed to thicken as her words hung in the silence. Marcus didn't back down. "Yes," he said firmly. "I want the truth." Celeria's expression hardened, and for the first time, the ethereal warmth she carried was replaced by something colder, sharper. "I am not what you think I am," she said, her voice steady but tinged with an emotion he couldn't place. "My species, we survive by consuming the energy of others. Not their bodies, Marcus. Their emotions, their desires, their passion. It sustains us, keeps us alive in this unforgiving world." Marcus stared at her, his mind racing to process her words. "So what?" he asked, his voice edged with anger. "You lure people here, charm them, and then feed on them?" Celeria's eyes softened again, though her gaze remained steady. "It is how I have survived," she said quietly. "But with you, it's different. I didn't expect you. I didn't expect to feel something in return." Her words hit him like a blow, and for a moment, he was unsure whether to step back or move closer. Anger warred with something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. "Everything you've said," he began, his voice low and tense, "everything you've done, was it all a lie?" "No," she said quickly, her voice breaking slightly. "Not with you. Not anymore." The sincerity in her eyes was undeniable, and Marcus found himself torn. The part of him that had spent his life surviving, fighting, refusing to trust, raged against her betrayal. But the part of him that had begun to feel again, to hope, to connect, couldn't deny the pull she had on him. Their eyes locked, and the tension between them exploded into something neither of them could control. Marcus reached for her, his movements rough and charged with emotion. Celeria didn't pull away. Instead, she met him with equal intensity, her hands finding his shoulders as their lips crashed together. The kiss was fierce, fueled by anger, longing, and something deeper that neither of them dared to name. It wasn't gentle or tentative like their first. It was raw, unfiltered, a collision of their vulnerabilities and their strength. His hands tangled in her hair, her touch sliding down his back, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. The warmth of the palace seemed to surge around them, the light pulsing brighter as if responding to their passion. And for that moment there was no anger, no doubt, no fear, only the two of them, lost in each other, their connection undeniable and unstoppable. As the days passed, the connection between Marcus and Celeria grew stronger, their bond a fusion of vulnerability and trust forged in the depths of shared truths. They no longer skirted around the emotions that had begun to tether them together. Celeria's once guarded demeanor softened in Marcus's presence, and Marcus, in turn, began to let go of the walls he had built over years of loss and battle-hardened survival. The palace, for all its beauty and mystery, seemed to respond to their closeness, its walls glowing with a warmer, more vibrant light, as if it, too, felt the energy between them. But that energy, so raw and unrestrained, was not without consequence. One evening, as Marcus and Celeria stood in the observatory beneath a sky filled with galaxies that shimmered like scattered jewels, the stillness of the moment was shattered. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the palace. It was subtle at first, a faint disturbance that could almost be mistaken for the natural rhythm of the structure. But as the seconds ticked by, it grew louder, deeper, more insistent, until it felt as though the very ground beneath their feet was trembling. Marcus's instincts, honed through countless battles, kicked in immediately. His hand dropped to his side, where his weapon was always within reach. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice sharp, his eyes scanning the room for a threat he couldn't yet see. Celeria's expression shifted, her luminous eyes narrowing as she turned toward the source of the sound. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, recognition and a shadow of dread. "It's impossible," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Before Marcus could press her, the hum erupted into a deafening roar, and the palace reacted violently. The walls, once smooth and serene, began to ripple and distort, their light flickering chaotically. A sharp, piercing sound cut through the air, and suddenly, the floor beneath them shook with such force that Marcus was nearly thrown off balance. Celeria reached for him, her touch steadying him even as the chaos around them intensified. "What's happening?" Marcus shouted over the noise. Celeria's voice trembled, but it held an edge of urgency. "Something ancient," she said, her words hurried. "Something that should have remained dormant. It has awakened." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Because of us?" Celeria hesitated, her expression filled with both guilt and determination. "Our emotions, the energy we've created, it must have drawn it here." Before Marcus could respond, a deafening crash echoed through the palace. A section of the wall to their left shattered, sending shards of crystal scattering across the floor. Through the jagged opening, a massive, shadowed figure emerged. It was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen, a creature of raw power and primal ferocity, its form shifting and writhing as though it were made of the very fabric of the world itself. Its eyes burned with an unrelenting light, and its presence exuded a primal hunger that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. The creature let out a guttural roar, its focus locking onto Celeria. Marcus moved instinctively, stepping in front of her, his weapon drawn and aimed at the towering figure. "Get behind me," he said firmly. Celeria didn't move. Instead, she stepped forward, her hands glowing faintly as she summoned a power Marcus hadn't seen before. "This is my fault," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "It was drawn to me. I must face it." Marcus's grip on his weapon tightened. "Like hell you will," he shot back. "We do this together." The creature lunged, its movements impossibly fast for its size. Marcus fired, the shots echoing through the chamber, but the bullets seemed to dissolve before they could reach their target. Celeria raised her hands, and a barrier of light formed between them and the creature, halting its advance. But the strain on her was evident, her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, and the glow around her began to flicker. "Marcus," she said, her voice strained. "I can't hold it for long." Marcus's mind raced. He scanned the room, searching for anything that could be used to their advantage. Then his eyes fell on the jagged remains of the shattered wall, sharp, crystalline fragments that glowed faintly with the same energy as the palace itself. "Can those hurt it?" he asked, nodding toward the shards. Celeria's gaze flickered to the fragments, and she hesitated before nodding. "Yes, but you can't get close enough. It will kill you." Marcus smirked, the soldier in him taking over. "I've faced worse." Before she could stop him, Marcus darted toward the shards, scooping up one of the larger pieces. The creature roared again, its focus shifting to him as he charged forward. Celeria cried out, but Marcus didn't falter. He moved with the precision and determination of someone who had nothing left to lose, dodging the creature's attacks with calculated agility. As he closed the distance, He hurled the shard with all his strength. The sharp, glowing fragment struck the creature square in its chest, embedding itself deep within its shifting form. The creature let out a deafening scream, its body convulsing as the energy of the shard spread through it. For a moment it seemed to weaken, its movements slowing, its light dimming. But the fight wasn't over. The creature lashed out one final time, its massive form surging toward Marcus. Celeria, seeing the danger, acted without hesitation. She threw herself between Marcus and the creature, her body glowing with an intense, blinding light. The creature struck her, and a shock wave rippled through the chamber, sending Marcus sprawling. When the light faded, the creature was gone. The palace was silent once more, its walls dim and still. Marcus pushed himself to his feet, his body aching from the impact. His eyes searched frantically until he found Celeria, collapsed on the floor, her glow faint but steady. He rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he cradled her. "Celeria," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Why did you do that?" Her eyes fluttered open, and she managed a faint smile. "Because you are worth it," she whispered. "For the first time, I feel alive." Marcus felt his chest tighten, his heart pounding as he held her close. "Don't you dare leave me," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't come this far to lose you." She reached up, her hand brushing against his cheek. "You've shown me something I thought I'd never feel again," she said softly. "Love." Tears stung Marcus's eyes as he pulled her closer, his voice a quiet vow. "We're not done yet," he said. "Not by a long shot." In that moment, the bond between them solidified, stronger than any force that had tried to tear them apart. Together, they had faced the impossible, and together, they would face whatever came next. For the first time in years, Marcus understood what it meant to truly fight, not for survival, but for someone worth living for. The silence after the battle was almost deafening, broken only by the faint creaking of the palace as its once vibrant energy flickered and faded. The crystalline walls, which had pulsed with life and light, were now dull and fractured, their once majestic form reduced to ruins. Celeria and Marcus stood amidst the rubble, their breaths visible in the freezing air as they leaned on each other for support. The predator was gone, vanquished by their combined strength, but the cost was evident in every crack and collapse of the palace around them. Marcus tightened his arm around Celeria's waist, steadying her as she stumbled. She was weaker now, her glow reduced to a faint shimmer, barely visible against the encroaching darkness of the frozen wasteland beyond. Her once effortless grace was now replaced by a fragile determination, each step an act of willpower. She leaned into him, her warmth still there but waning, her body trembling as if the fight had stripped her of more than just her strength. "We need to keep moving," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "This place isn't going to hold much longer." Celeria nodded, though her movements were sluggish. Her eyes, once radiant and filled with boundless energy, now seemed tired, vulnerable in a way that Marcus had never seen before. "The cold it will take us," she murmured, her voice soft, almost resigned. "Without the palace, there's nothing left to shield us." Marcus glanced down at her, his jaw tightening. "Not if I have anything to say about it," he replied, pulling her closer as they began their trek into the wasteland. The storm had calmed, but the air was still bitterly cold, each gust biting into their skin with merciless precision. Marcus kept his arm firmly around Celeria, his own body aching from the effort of keeping them both upright. The snow crunched beneath their boots, the sound a stark reminder of the isolation that surrounded them. There was nothing but endless white in every direction, and yet, with her by his side, Marcus felt a flicker of determination he hadn't known he still possessed. After what felt like hours of trudging through the relentless cold, they found shelter in a small cave nestled against a rocky outcropping. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but inside, the space opened into a low, quiet chamber, its walls lined with frost that sparkled faintly in the dim light of the distant moons. Marcus helped Celeria to the ground, her body sinking into the makeshift bedding he'd managed to assemble from his jacket and what little insulation the cave provided. She lay back, her breaths shallow but steady, her skin cooler than he remembered. He knelt beside her, his hands brushing against hers as he adjusted the makeshift covering around her shoulders. "You're freezing," he said, his voice rough with worry. "You need to rest." Celeria's lips curved into a faint smile, though it lacked the strength it once carried. "I think I'm becoming more like you," she murmured. "Less ethereal, more fragile." Marcus shook his head, his fingers tightening around hers. "You're not fragile," he said firmly. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever known." Her gaze softened, her luminous eyes searching his face. "You're the reason I've survived this long," she whispered. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" Marcus asked, his voice quieter now. Celeria's hand moved, her fingers brushing against his cheek. "Hope," she said simply. "A reason to keep fighting. To keep living." Marcus's chest tightened at her words, a flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers as he closed his eyes. "You've done the same for me," he admitted. "Before I met you, I was just surviving. Existing. But now—" His words trailed off, but he didn't need to finish. Celeria's fingers curled around his, her touch weak but steady. She pulled him closer, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was slow and tender, a reflection of everything they had been through together. It wasn't the fiery passion of their earlier encounters, but something deeper, more intimate, a quiet promise that neither of them would face the darkness alone. They stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, the cold of the cave forgotten as they lost themselves in each other. For that moment there was no uncertainty, no fear, only the warmth of their connection, a fragile but undeniable light against the encroaching shadows. When the kiss finally broke, Celeria rested her head against his chest, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You've given me a reason to live again," she said, her words carrying the weight of her gratitude, her love. Marcus held her close, his arms wrapped around her as though he could shield her from the entire world. "And I'm not letting you go," he said quietly. "Not now. Not ever." They stayed like that until the first light of dawn began to creep into the cave, the frozen wasteland outside painted in shades of pale blue and silver. The world felt impossibly vast, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus didn't feel alone. As they prepared to leave the cave, Marcus checked his comm device, hoping against hope that it would pick up a signal. To his surprise, the screen flickered to life, a faint, pulsing light indicating an incoming message. He frowned, his fingers moving quickly to decipher the transmission. It was a warning, brief, cryptic, and unsettling. "You've been tracked. They're coming." Marcus's grip on the device tightened, his mind racing. He glanced at Celeria, who was watching him with quiet concern. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady despite her weakened state. Marcus hesitated, the weight of the message heavy in his chest. "Someone's looking for me," he said. "And it doesn't sound like a rescue." Celeria's expression didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze, a glimmer of power, faint but unmistakable. Despite her fading strength, there was still something within her, something he couldn't fully understand. "We'll face it together," she said, her voice resolute. Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. Whatever lay ahead, they would confront it as they had everything else, together. And as they stepped out into the frozen wasteland, the uncertainty of the future was tempered by the unshakable bond they had forged, a bond that would carry them through whatever came next. If you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.